All right, everybody, welcome back to the KSL.com Game Center podcast. Yes, this is still a thing. It's been a few months, but new year, new me, new us, and new episode for you guys. There's obviously a lot going on, not only in Utah sports, but nationwide, worldwide right now. And that's actually something that we want to touch on right now, is a subject that has certainly captured the attention and emotions of people everywhere, and has wide-ranging effects, and it's something that we want to touch on today. I'm joined by Sean Walker, BYU beat reporter and writer at KSL.com. How you doing today, Sean, on this fine Saturday morning?
Caleb, I'm doing awesome. I'm doing great. I'm feeling energized. And yeah, this is a subject that I'm a little bit passionate about. So it's really cool to be able to talk about and to kind of process some emotions and maybe some less talked about emotions, I think, from a national story that made a lot of headlines. And fortunately, it looks like it's going to have about as happy of an ending as we can expect.
Yeah, not to keep the curtain veiled on this any longer. Yeah, obviously talking about what happened with the Buffalo Bills defensive back Damar Hamlin this week in a game early this week against the Cincinnati Bengals. Um, I think a lot of people know what happened by this point. It's been all over the news, ESPN or whatever website you've been reading. He had a cardiac event, went into cardiac arrest. They were able to resuscitate him there on the field. And he was transported to the hospital immediately. He was in ICU for several days on a breathing tube, and eventually was able to recover, not fully yet, but to the point where he was able to show physical signs, talk with people, did a FaceTime with teammates and things like that. So as Sean mentioned, certainly things looking up, and hopefully a happy ending for this story. But I think, even with a hopefully happy ending, there were a lot of emotions, as you mentioned, and a lot of effects of kind of what happened, what people saw on the field on Monday night. And so we want to kind of dive into that, as you mentioned, things that might not be talked about as often, things that are going on underneath the skin, underneath the superficial of what we talk about a lot of time in sports. And so maybe we can just talk about our initial reactions ourselves at first to what we saw on the field. I know we were chatting about it a bit before we started recording, but just the reactions of the players on the field, what you saw from guys like Josh Allen, from Joe Burrow, and obviously all the Bills teammates, very emotional and just intense scenes to be watching. I know, there were a lot of takes fired off on social media that evening, on TV that evening, and we're not going to go into all that. But from a human perspective, it was a tough scene to watch. And so I'm curious, for you, Sean, what did you see, and maybe what made you want to look a little bit deeper and kind of talk about the subject a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean the number one thing that we all saw was this just terrible event. What came to be a cardiac episode involving Damar Hamlin on the field. You're immediately drawn to Damar and kind of the way that he went down, the episode that he had, and everybody is just staring intently at this process play out as medical professionals are doing what they do best, and trying to resuscitate him. And so I think that was kind of number one in the front of everybody's minds. But beyond that, I kept looking around at the players on the field. There was this image of Josh Allen in particular, Buffalo Bills quarterback Josh Allen, that as he was standing on the sidelines, just completely shell shocked at one of his teammates, one of his brothers, the starting defensive back out of Pitt, and watching him just lay prone, lifeless, or at least helpless on the field. It was one of those images that was kind of seared into my brain Monday night as I was watching this entire process play out. And the thing I kept coming back to, Caleb, was how, like, I've seen a lot of injuries happen. A lot of players have seen a lot of injuries happen. Football is a violent sport. We all know that. But I've always wondered how players can rebound from the trauma of injury, on the court, on the field, on whatever playing surface. Um, they're involved in. Like it's just it feels like it's such a kind of a mental hurdle to get back into the battle, to get back into game mode after seeing a teammate sometimes leave the room in an ambulance. Like that's got to be tough. That's got to be really, really tough. And I think in this situation, it was handled about as well as can be expected. A big shout out to Bills head coach Sean McDermott and his Bengals counterpart Zach Taylor, who they kind of came together in midfield and were like, look, like neither of our teams are in a position where we can play right now. We need to we need to press pause. We need to suspend this game. Like, let's talk to the league and see if that's possible. They kind of took their teams into their respective locker rooms and as they discussed some of those options. And I thought the coaches handled that very, very well in particular. But then in the coming days, as you're waiting for updates, and eventually the updates are turning more and more positive, which again is great. You're also wondering, like, how can these players sort of rebound and even if they didn't have to go and play that game eventually got canceled by the NFL. How do they rebound for a Week 18 game for an important playoff push? You know, the Bills are one of the favorite teams they're one of the best teams in the NFL right now, right?
Yeah.
So how do they kind of take this moment and galvanize it and on a 53-man roster get a bunch of players to kind of re-buy in some ways to realize that, like, yes, this is a tragedy, yes, this is a trauma, but how do they go out and play for Damar now? I think was sort of the question that I had, and I talked with it a lot. I talked with former NFL player who's now a mental health coach in San Diego, Mike Gibson. He played for the Eagles, the Seahawks, and the Cardinals before he retired back in 2013. And then I also talked to Utah Valley's own Doc Woods, Kevin Woods II. He's a mental health specialist for Utah Valley University Athletics. He played Division I basketball for Utah Valley. And that was just a lot of what we talked about was kind of the secondary sort of injuries, I guess, the mental health side of watching an injury and how you can recover from that, while obviously, again, the most important thing is the physically injured, and watching guys like Damar as they kind of progress in their own physical recovery there. But I think there is another mental side to this that's important to talk about as well, for sure.
Yeah, totally. And I think, that was, what you did, I think was the right call. Having a question, having this image impact you, right? Seeing how these players were reacting, and then trying to go to people who are experts in this field, right? Have dealt with this, both on the player side and also on the specialist side, to advocate and to help these people who go through these experiences. We're gonna get some of that sound from this interview with Mike Gibson, a former NFL player and mental health advocate, later on in this episode. But yeah, just to kind of, in general, kind of go over, I guess, what you're able to learn, or maybe what some of the takeaways are from this. Maybe how are players able to overcome these kinds of traumatic events, and what are some key things that can help in overcoming this?
Yeah, one of the big things that Mike and I talked about was the humanization that occurred with this event, where a lot of times we're watching football on our television, and this is a business, this is an entertainment product, right? These players are entertainers. And I think that can be a little bit dangerous sometimes when we view them too much as just entertainment. They don't become humans anymore. But like Damar Hamlin became so much more than just a Buffalo Bills defensive back at this moment when he went down. He became somebody's brother. He became somebody's son. He was humanized in a way that we probably don't do nearly enough with professional athletes, right? So the humanization definitely, like, I think that helped a lot of us to realize, like, there is so much more than football right now at this time. We were able to just sort of take a step back and say, look, football is not the important thing right now. Somebody's life is hanging in the balance. These are real human beings with families, with friends, with people that are impacted by them beyond even the scope of their job. We're all more than our own jobs, and so are these football players as well. So I think that was kind of the number one thing was just the overall humanization of of these players that are going through real life, actual trauma, and how they managed it, how they processed it, how they were processing it in real times in a lot of ways on live television. I think that was the big thing to kind of just help us all take a step back, and that was something that I talked about a lot with Doc. Was it's important to take a step back from trauma and realize what you're feeling, what you're thinking about, what's going through your head. Sometimes that involves turning off the TV after you've gotten all of the information that you feel like you need. But don't just like turn it off and completely ignore it either. Don't get lost in your own headspace. I think it's the way that Doc phrased it a lot of times. But actually talk about it with somebody that you trust, with a loved one, with a mental health professional, with family members, maybe around the dinner table with parents and their children. You can talk about stuff like this and just sort of see where everybody is at, and if anybody's kind of struggling to recoil from these traumatic events. Don't run away from it necessarily, but also find a way to kind of just get out of that headspace and not get lost in the never-ending spiral of despair and, oh, football is just a dangerous game. Oh, in football, we like this stuff shouldn't happen. Like that's not necessarily the full answer either. So there's kind of a balance, and I think just a constant like discussion to be had. Probably something that if we really went into it entirely, we'd probably be here for another 4.5 hours. And I definitely don't want to put you through that, Caleb. But I think it is important just to have those conversations with people that you trust, and whether they be professionals or non-professionals or that kind of thing, to help kind of manage your emotions in times of injury related trauma like this.
No, I think that's spot on, especially what you mentioned about the humanization and also trying to find a balance. I think it's something that we struggle with or confront even as journalists trying to cover these games and these sports and these athletes, right? Is how do you balance kind of the very game stat driven aspect of sport? How do you balance that with the human aspect of it? The fact that these are people underneath these helmets, underneath these jerseys, behind these games, right? That are playing, and they're people, and they have stories, and we try to tell those stories, right? But I think there certainly is a balance to be had between reporting on as a game and reporting on it as a human element. And I think we've hopefully, as you mentioned, this event has helped people understand that a little bit more. It wasn't about your fantasy score on Monday night, right? It wasn't about whatever prop bet you had made. Suddenly this game, we get caught up in it so often that this game just becomes numbers to us. But I think those numbers were shattered, and what was left was just this human element. I think one really cool thing that I saw was the donations to Damar Hamlin's toy fundraiser that he was doing. It was at just a few $1,000s, I think, on Monday. It had been started, I believe, a couple of years ago, and just within the span of a night, gained millions of dollars from people realizing, hey, there's this guy was a real person who had real objectives and passions in life. He wanted to help people. And if that had been the end, right, they want to do something in his name to honor him. Luckily, it's not the end for Damar Hamlin. But I think that was certainly something that we saw. And I love what you mentioned of just trying to refocus on that human element of sport in general.
Yeah, that was a great story, right? Wasn't it? Like there's this GoFundMe for the Chasing M's Foundation. We should give a shout out. We'll link to the website in the show notes of this episode even. But yeah, the Chasing M's Foundation had a GoFundMe for a charity toy drive where they wanted to raise $2,500 to help distribute toys to at risk and to at risk children in the Buffalo area, I believe. By Hamlin's Foundation. So they wanted $2,500. They were right around there on Monday night when this happened. And then football fans just caught wind of this donation and just started donating en masse to where it passed $3 million, I think, within 24 hours. This drive. Finally, it got over $7 million. And Damar's dad, Mario, actually had to come out and release a statement saying, hey, thanks guys for doing this. Like your support is awesome. It's really helped Damar as he struggles and as he fights in his hospital bed. Like he's really uplifted by this. more than 225,000 people donating out of their own money, like NFL players, GMs, coaches, as well as just the casual fans. Like that was all great. And then Mario Hamlin comes out and says, by the way, like if you really want to help, there's a website, the Chasing Hymns Foundation, where we can probably better manage the flow of some of these donations. Can you please go there so we don't necessarily have to go through the GoFundMe, which was just a little bit of a kind of an interesting take right there. That there was so much like an outpouring of so much generosity that that Damar's dad even has to come out and say, hey, can we just redirect you guys to a different link? Because this is getting to be a lot. We really appreciate it. That website's chasinghymnsfoundation.com. Like I said, we'll link to it in the show notes of this episode. But yeah, it was just really cool to just see that response. Like in times like this, you see you see so much bad in the world, and it's really easy to magnify that through the internet, through social media. I certainly struggle with that. I feel like just weekly I go down this spiral of schadenfreude, if you will, just seeing the bad in the world. But it's also really easy to see the good in the world with traumatic events like this. And that was just one example, I think, right there that kind of help you realize that like there is more than football. There is more than just your fantasy score. There are real life human beings here, and there are people out there that are connected to the game that just want to be better people, that want to try to make a difference, and then they're trying to figure out a way to turn tragedy, to turn trauma into something for the better. I think was kind of the big takeaway from that.
No, I totally agree with that. And I hope that is the takeaway, not only from this event, but from this podcast and from your discussions and from this article as well. It's going to come out. I think, what happened on Monday created kind of a dark and sad feeling for a lot of people, which has luckily just in the span of less than a week turned into a more inspiring and hopeful story. And I think, with what you mentioned, from these mental health specialists, hopefully can turn into an opportunity to have conversations, to allow for more healing, because we all need it. We all need to talk to people. We all have things that are going on. We all have different trauma in our lives. So whatever way we can cope with that and how we can kind of get over that and begin this healing process, I think is wonderful. So I won't take any more time away from these discussions with these experts. I certainly am not the expert on this, but I'm looking forward to hearing more from these discussions. So yeah, without further ado, we'll move on to Sean's discussion with former NFL player and mental health advocate Mike Gibson.
Joining us now on the show, all the way from his home on the warm West Coast, I am joined by former NFL athlete, longtime NFL player, lineman for I'm probably going to leave somebody out, I believe the Eagles, the Cardinals, and the Seahawks.
Yep.
Spend a cup of coffee up in the Pacific Northwest with Seattle there. That's the one that I always forget. But it's Mike Gibson, former NFL player, 2008 6th-round draft pick by the Eagles up until about the 2013 season. And now Mike, who I'm not going to call old because he's almost the exact same age as me, so I would never, ever do that. But Mike is a mental health and addiction recovery advocate for a number of places, including the Mental Health Center of San Diego, which is how we got in contact with. So I'll give them the plug there. But I wanted to invite Mike on the podcast, on the show, to talk to us a little bit about mental health as it relates to NFL players, and specifically with regards to kind of the situation that we're talking about, to experiencing and processing injury-related trauma among teammates. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining me, and welcome to the podcast, which the studio is not much. It's probably even less on your side. We're recording all virtually, guys. That was a joke. That was a really bad joke. But thanks for joining me for a couple of minutes, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean. It's the company that makes it all worth it. Right?
That's right. I appreciate you lying. The check's in the mail. I appreciate you lying on my behalf, but thank you very much.
Yep.
Mike, we connected through a mutual friend of ours after a really unfortunate, a really sad incident that has fortunately gotten better, I think, as the week has gone on. on Monday Night Football between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Buffalo Bills, when Bills defense back Damar Hamlin just very tragically, stunningly in a lot of ways, passed out on the field. He was unconscious, and thanks to some heroic efforts by the athletic training staff, doctors, physicians, EMTs that were on site, he was taken away to the hospital, and he is fortunately recovering very, very well. Just barely got taken off of the breathing tube at UC, University of Cincinnati Medical Center there in Cincinnati. So our hearts and our prayers and our best wishes go out to Damar. We don't want that to we don't want this conversation to kind of overshadow what he's going through right now. But with him recovering, I thought it would be a good time to open up a conversation around kind of the other struggles that were brought to the forefront that night in Cincinnati. We all saw the images on Monday Night Football. I thought ESPN actually did a very good job on the broadcast of kind of walking through a very unfortunate situation. But one thing that struck out to me was the images of the Bills and the Bengals in particular coming together in the middle of the field in prayer, kind of walking around, stunned looks on their faces. Josh Allen, I think, quarterback for the Bills, really stands out in a lot of people's mind, which is like you saw sort of this injury to Damar. And kind of the impact and the effect that it was having on these players. And at the moment, there was even a thought of like, hey, this is an important game. Like, they're going to have to restart this. You've been around the league, Mike. Like, how difficult is that for players to like process this type of injury trauma, especially when something traumatic is happening, like an ambulance has to come out on the field? Like, how do you kind of begin to process something like that happening to a teammate, to a confidant, to a brother in so many ways on that 53-man roster?
Yeah. So first off, happy to hear that Damar is doing much better. Praying for him, not only for a partial recovery, but a full recovery, because right now he's partially recovered. Right. So,
yes.
I'm sure his ultimate goal is to get back on that field. I know mine would be, right, as crazy as that. But, like when I first saw it and I was watching it, obviously we didn't know the extent of it. It almost looked like it was a normal hit. Unfortunately, we've seen it so many times, especially lately, where somebody hits somebody, and then Tua was a recent one that I think of too. He gets hit, he tries to get up, and then he falls back down. So I saw that, and, it wasn't until, I saw that it was kind of a bigger issue when they started talking about they were resuscitating, Mr. Hamlin in that situation. So unfortunately, like, injuries happen in football. They happen every single day in practice. They happen every single day in games, right? There's certain things that go on. Seeing somebody, it's almost a frequent thing now, seeing somebody get hit, get a concussion. So I think when everything switched, it wasn't when the ambulance came out, because that's almost like we see that happen sometimes now, right? It's not like a super frequent situation, but the second that they started to do resuscitation, right? Now, I know for me, I've never seen it on a football field. I know the other people, majority of the other gentlemen out there, I definitely have not seen it. So when that happens, everything changes. But there's a brotherhood that goes on with every single player on the team. You guys go through training camp together. You're battling each other every single day. There's a respect, and you ultimately think about their family, right? Like, this is much bigger than football. This is life and death. I think we as players, we know that something like this can happen, but we never believe that it can be one of us. So whether you're watching it on TV or whether you're there in person, right? It's completely different when you're there in person, right? You feel the major impact of it, because that's the reality of the situation. So I think, psychologically, it's going to take a toll on the people that were there. I know for me, I'm like, even if it's a 1 in a million shot, that's what they're saying, right? We don't know exactly what went on with him, but if it was the situation where he got hit at the chest at the perfect time, and now you look back at some clips, there's a hockey player that had it done, a baseball player that had that happen to him. You're thinking, man, that could be me, And in reality of it is if they didn't start that CPR maybe a few minutes later, then maybe Damar wouldn't be here today.
Well, and fortunately they did, and Damar is still alive. He's in the hospital at UC at University of Cincinnati Medical Center, like we mentioned. It seems like he's going to recover. I come from a medical background, so I had to give a special shout out to the athletic trainers that were there, the first responders on that field. Absolutely, just heroic stuff that that those guys really spread. The way those guys sprang into action and saved his life, quite literally saved his life. I think is really awesome. So let's kind of go through sort of the moments after this injury, I guess, when the game is being suspended, it eventually gets canceled. But you've got now, you've got a 53-man roster on both sides, so 100 and I'm really bad at math, like 105 other players that are out there kind of trying to process what they just saw and also thinking like, hey, are we going to have to play this game again? Oh, by the way, it's only week 17. Like we've got one more game left. There's the rest of the season to go out there and to play football. A very, like you mentioned, a very violent sport. We're all aware of the violence that is triggered by the game of football. But how do you kind of how do these players kind of compartmentalize, I guess, sort of that initial trauma, I guess, to say, this is still our job. I still want to do this. But this one also kind of fit a little bit differently. Like, are there ways that maybe the average NFL player, and I know mental health advocacy and mental health operations have kind of advanced over the last couple of years to sort of help players along with some of this? Like, are there ways that players can sort of move forward while Damar obviously moves forward in his physical journey of getting back to health?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that go into play in that. Obviously Damar's doing much better. He's progressively getting better every day, right? Today I saw that he had spoken to his team via FaceTime, which is huge. So understanding that that's what Damar wants, right? Damar wants them to go out and play, right? So that kind of switches your perspective on the whole thing, right? You go from, man, I don't know if I should do this or want to do this or can do this, to I need to do this. I now want to do this and I can do this, right? I think the other issue is maybe, which is more of an NFL issue, is, 95% of that roster doesn't have a choice if they want to continue playing this game. And that's the position I was in for basically all 6 years of my career. And there's other things that have attributed to that, but we won't get into that individual stuff, right? But in regards to, a lot of those guys don't have a choice that they want to continue playing, right? It's the Josh Allen speaking up. It's the Joe Burrows. It's the 1% on that team, the captains, essentially, that are going out there and making a decision, for the rest of the team, which is good. They're standing up and they're doing it in a positive way. They're standing up not only for what they believe in, because in my opinion, I think that the NFL would have kept that game going had Sean McDermott and Zach Taylor said, we can get this game going. That's my personal opinion. Unfortunately, it's about dollar bills with them, and it's been that way since when I started. To say that they give 100% about current players, former players, I would say that's BS.
Yeah, I mean, there is still there is still a very strong business aspect of the NFL, and this is a business, and in a lot of ways, unfortunately, these players can be looked at as commodities sometimes. It's really unfortunate. And I don't think it happens with everybody. I don't think that's the case with everybody in the league or with various teams, but I think it is it can be easy to see players as business commodities far too often. So I'm totally with you. Like, big shout out to both the Bills and the Bengals organizations for saying, no, like, let's take a step back. Like, let's figure out there's something so much bigger here. And there were a lot of much smarter people than me that were on ESPN that were talking about that kind of as it was going through as well. So I want to give that network a shout out.
It's choice. right? And whether the NFL wanted to continue or not, right? And when I speak about the NFL, so to speak, I'm talking about front office New York. I don't think, the people that are in the buildings with the players, I think that they have a different perspective as the people, Roger Goodell, everybody up in New York. They don't interact with any of the players. Maybe the 1% on one team, the Tom Brady's, the Joe Burrows, the Josh Allen. Sure, Goodell might say hi to them, but, what about the rest of your employees? And, the 52, the 53rd guy, to the practice squad guy,
No, for sure, for sure. And these are the people that I think, these are the guys that I think sort of moving forward and channeling what they just saw maybe matters the most in some ways. So there are some things that the NFL is doing to kind of honor Damar and I think in some ways maybe help not just him, obviously first and foremost Damar Hamlin, like he is number one in this scenario, but also everybody else to process what they're feeling and their emotions surrounding this very traumatic event. There are some pretty cool things that the league is doing league wide, every team, in terms of every team is going to have a pregame. They're calling it a moment of support. So not a moment of silence. This isn't a tragedy because Damar is getting better, but they're calling on like fans everywhere to cheer for Damar before every game, which is really cool. There are T-shirts being worn by the players during pregame warmups, which is really cool. The 3 on the 30-yard line and our number is going to be stenciled in Bills blue or Bills red, depending on the stadium, which I think is kind of cool. Can we, as fans of the NFL and outsiders, sometimes media, everything else, we sometimes see stuff like this and we go, okay, that's a cool gesture. What does it really mean at the end of the day? But can gestures like that help with that sort of healing process for some of these players? And obviously, again, first and foremost, Damar and his family as they're moving forward, but also other players as they kind of process their emotions and channel their emotions to move past it.
Yeah, I mean, this is, this is something that we've never seen in the NFL before, right? Like I haven't seen it in my lifetime, right? If you go back and I don't watch much hockey, but there was a hockey player that had the same incident, and I had recently seen that. But other than that, this is the first time that anything like this has really ever happened. I've always kind of seen and thought, right, like it's inevitable, it's going to happen. The size and speed of certain individual players, somebody's eventually going to pass away on the field at some point. But it wasn't in this fashion that I thought, right? And he's still alive, thank goodness, right? But I think it's a way for the current players to recognize it and the fans to recognize it, not forget about it and move forward. So, which I think is important in any process of mental health, right? Is to recognize the incident or whatever happened, to process it, to understand it, and then to move forward. That's how we not get over things, because we don't want to forget things that we've gone through, right? Because it's going to make us better in the long run.
That's how these kinds of things make us better in the long run. And I think that's actually a really good point, and maybe a good point to kind of to end this conversation on is what happened Monday night in Cincinnati was really unfortunate, but there are things that can be done to kind of make the game a little bit better, maybe to make our understanding of the game from a viewership perspective, from a fan perspective, from a media perspective, also a little bit better. It's important that we don't necessarily like forget what happened, but that we remember that football's a violent sport. Something like this, unfortunately, is probably pretty inevitable. How we rally around Damar, how we rally around the Bills, how we rally around kind of the situation can actually make the overall football community maybe better in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think what it does, what I feel it does, is it makes us as athletes, not only football players, other athletes, baseball, basketball, hockey is another one, right? It makes the fans understand that we're human. I think sometimes they think that we're robots, or that we're Superman, and the reality of it is we're everyday people.